As you say, I'm a senior archaeologist now with Historic England. Been working with them for 3 decades now, on and off. And as part of our work, after the split in 2015 rather, when English Heritage Trust was set up and took all the properties and the name English Heritage, and then left Historic England as a separate government body, we've effectively acted as their sort of in-house band for excavation work on historic properties that English Heritage is in charge of. So we still provide the same sort of service that we were providing to them before the split. Just now there's a bit of a border between. And as part of that service, we got involved with Marble Hill. They wanted to improve the site, and essentially the house was looking a bit run down. It needed a major overhaul. The gardens had a century of essentially council-led abandonment. The formal elements had all sort of faded away in favor of just large woodland chunks and such. And they wanted to turn back the clock a bit in the hopes that also this would also generate a bit more footfall on the site. So we got involved in 2016 with the first bit of excavations, and then 2 more phases of excavation in 2017, and a phase of excavation in 2020, and some more in 2021, ending with a watching brief at the start of last year. So that's how we began the process. And the project has involved a number of colleagues. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, possibly, this is Marble Hill House itself, a lovely Palladian villa on the banks of the Thames in Twickenham, just across the river from Richmond. And it's one of those properties, it's fairly understated and yet surprisingly important the more you research it. So we started work, as I say, in 2016. Oops, sorry, my slides are jumping all over the place at the moment. And this aerial photo, taken from a well-known online mapping site, who shall remain nameless, shows the extent of the park, which surprisingly is pretty much the extent of the grounds that the house was originally established within. It hasn't been encroached and it hasn't been enlarged. Unlike the rest of Twickenham, which pretty much has been covered in housing estates in the last century or so. Within the middle of these gardens, of course, is the house. So the red arrow pointing at it there. By the way, you'll notice from time to time, hopefully, a purple cursor floating around the screen. I chose that gaudy color in order to make it stand out against all the various slides in lieu of a laser pointer. Right, so the other thing to do at the house is the formal gardens. And this is where almost all of our work focused as part of this project. And I will say that English Heritage Trust secured a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund for the maximum they could get to restore the house and improve the grounds. And a lot of this work was driven by the timetable to deliver that project. And most of it was focused within this rectangular area of formal gardens, as opposed to the wider areas, much of which is used as playing fields at the moment, and therefore didn't need a huge amount of work doing to it. Right, now the house owes its existence to this remarkable woman, Lady Henrietta Howard. She was born to minor aristocracy, to a baronet, and married to Charles Howard, who is one of the sons of the Earl of Suffolk. And being a younger son, he was the third son of the family, he wasn't ever meant to see the title. He wasn't going to become Earl of Suffolk, although that turned out not to be quite true. And instead followed the usual path of younger sons of nobility and became a wastrel. So when Henrietta married him, he had a penchant for gambling, for drinking, for womanizing, and for basically going through people's money like there was no tomorrow. And back then, of course, if you were a wife, your money, your property belonged to your husband. So it wasn't long before they were in a bit of financial bind. And at this point in time, we're talking about Queen Anne's reign. And Queen Anne, toward the end, people knew that the end was coming sooner or later. She was not going to have any children, therefore another heir would have to be found, a Protestant heir to the British throne. And after casting about quite a bit, the government eventually settled on the Empress Sophia in an area of what's now Germany. And when she predeceased Queen Anne, the heir presumptive title went to her son, George, the Elector of Hanover, who comes across eventually to become George I in 1714. And everyone knew this was the way things were going. So Lady Henrietta quite wisely picked up with her husband Charles and moved to Hanover to embed themselves within the Hanoverian court, because that's where the money and the power were going to be fairly shortly. And it worked out fairly well for them. Lady Henrietta became lady-in-waiting to Princess Caroline, who is the wife of the younger Prince George, who becomes George II. It gets a bit confusing with all the Georges. And her husband is given various posts to do with cavalry, etc., essentially to keep him out of the way. And as part of the deal, of course, Lady Henrietta eventually becomes mistress to George II. Back then, official mistresses were a thing, unlike today. And she was welcomed into the role, actually, by Princess Caroline, who said that, you know, she was happy that her husband had quite a nice person as his mistress, because it was expected that the wives of nobility were there to provide children, as opposed to being companions to the male nobility. All of this was all well and good. 1714, Queen Anne rather, dies, and George comes over to become George I, brings with him the entire court, including his son, who becomes George II, as we say. And they then have a big falling out, the two Georges. There's an incident involving a baptism and the threat of a duel between the younger Prince George and a member of the English aristocracy that George I has to quash effectively. You can't have the heir to the throne fighting duels and possibly losing. And this causes a split between father and son, which means that the young prince, who is going to become king after his father, effectively sets up his own rival court. So they have a court in London, and there's a summer court out of London, as fairly typical of the time. And that's going to lead to the reason why the house is where it is. But as part of that, the court that he assembles includes all sorts of intellectuals: Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, etc. All the younger sort of artistic movers and shakers who don't fit in with the fairly staid court of George I. So it's an interesting mix. And as part of that, I mentioned that there's usually a summer court and a winter court. And for his summer court, Prince George decides to settle in Richmond, out in West London. And if I get this right, yep, that's the site of Marble Hill Park in Twickenham. And it's just across the river from where the site of Richmond Palace would have been before it was demolished in the 17th century. And the reason she has her house there is that Richmond Lodge is up at the top of this image, is where George I decides to settle in those wilderness years, shall we say, before, right at the end of George I's reign, when the two Georges make up. And as part of this, of course, everyone who wants to be part of Prince George's court wants to find somewhere, a weekend pad, shall we say, somewhere in this area along the Thames. Back in the day, of course, the river was both more efficient and safer transport to and from the various palaces along it than the roads would have been. Twickenham at that point in time wasn't the conurbation that we now know. It was a series of small hamlets and market gardens along a fairly poor quality road, where highwaymen and such would lurk. So it was always a bit of a risky proposition to be traveling along it. So riverfront property was the big thing. And the position of Marble Hill House is interesting because as part of a dowry given to Lady Henrietta as mistress from George, he couldn't actually give her money because obviously her husband could get her hands on it, would spend it. So instead, he set up a trust fund. And he set that trust fund up with a chap by the name of Archibald Campbell, originally the Earl of Islay, later to become Duke of Argyll, who happened to be born just across the river here at Ham House. So he knew the area well, picked a good plot of land for Lady Henrietta, and was involved in her affairs pretty much for the rest of his life. Now, the rest of the area was settled by a number of people. This area here, just between the bridge to Richmond and Marble Hill, was Cambridge House, which is now just a giant housing estate. We get Orleans House next door. Round the bend here, you've got Strawberry Hill, built by Horace Walpole, and slightly up the road from it was the house of Alexander Pope, who was within walking distance, effectively, of Lady Henrietta's new place, which comes into play as part of the development of it. And of course, we then have Richmond Park itself, just the other side here, on the right-hand side. So, in order to build her house, she had access to some very important people, because obviously being mistress to the heir presumptive. So on the left, we have Roger Morris, an architect of the day, and we have Henry Herbert, the 9th Earl of Pembroke, known as the Architect Earl, who between them conspired to develop a Palladian house in order to build Marble Hill. And they built others. Oops, sorry. So yeah, my mouse control is going a bit pear-shaped. Anyway, so that's Marble Hill House, built in the Palladian style, which means it's an Italian villa, effectively. Andrea Palladio was a 16th century, I believe, Italian architect who was fascinated by the antiquities of Rome and wrote a 4-volume series about effectively classical architecture with a strong focus on villas because that was his thing. And we have the standard villa design with the piano nobile, the grand floor effectively on first floor level. You have an entrance floor with an assembly hall effectively at the bottom, and then more domestic apartments heading up, including servants' quarters in the garret. And it's a fairly good classical form. Now, in addition to the two architects mentioned, Colin Campbell has been mentioned associated with the house, and he drew some plans for it. Although it's a bit debatable as to how much active involvement he had in the original design, as opposed to it being the work mostly of Morris and the 9th Earl. And in his version, of course, the only major difference we have is this flight of stairs on the north side. It doesn't exist on the real house. But we have the entranceway. On the ground floor, there's a square sort of assembly atrium flanked by domestic rooms. There's a lovely mahogany flight of stairs leading up to the first floor, which has just been conserved, but of course, as with all things 18th century, is besmirched by that horrible triangle trade, because that's where mahogany comes from. And on the first floor, of course, you have the large cube room, because it's as tall as it is wide and long. There was a fashion at the time designing these perfect spaces, flanked by other rooms. And they use that as a meeting space at the moment, which is quite an impressive room. And yeah, in addition to Colin Campbell's drawings, Roger Morris and the 9th Earl also conspired nearby at the White Lodge in Richmond Park, a slightly more muscular version of a Palladian villa. Obviously, they designed to suit the client's budget, and although Lady Henrietta was given a dowry from the king, she wasn't of the landed gentry herself. She didn't have estates in the countryside and the sums of money that the great and the good had. So obviously, they did have to sort of cut the cloth accordingly. Interestingly, Marble Hill House, they start work on it in 1724, finish in 1729, and create a lovely understated Palladian villa. This other villa, by another chap that we may all know, Lord Burlington, Richard Boyle, the man who is touted mainly as the originator of Palladian architecture in Britain, starts work in 1726. So a couple of years later. And we know that Lord Burlington also had within his possession some original Palladio drawings that had come from Inigo Jones, who a century earlier was designing classical architecture for Charles I. So it's an interesting twist on the standard narrative of Palladianism in Britain. Right, so she's got the great and the good designing her house. And the one last slide to do with the house that I'd show before we move on, and it's worth everyone seeing it if you get a chance. This is in the cube room. On the wall here, there's a lovely, basically full-life painting of Charles I. It was there when I first saw the house at the start of the project, before the restoration work, and then after the restoration work, which is what we see here, it was put back up, despite me pointing out to a number of conservative curators, rather, at English Heritage, that in the Hanoverian period, having a full-length portrait of a Jacobite king might be considered treason, but it's there anyway. So it's worth going to see. So in addition to having the greatest people involved in the design of her house, she also had some fairly high-profile people involved in the design of the gardens. On the left, we have Alexander Pope, who, as I say, lived maybe 10 minutes walk away, and was quite heavily involved in between his poetry works in designing garden features for some fairly high-profile lords. And on the right, we have Charles Bridgeman, who, of course, was gardener to the king. And the two of them were at the vanguard of the change in garden design in England from the sort of continental, very geometric, so-called Dutch style that we see through the 16th and 17th centuries, with lots of very formal geometric beds, often clipped to ankle height, so you can see across the whole garden in one sweep, basically showing off that you can afford an army of gardeners to maintain it. But it's a transition from that to gardens that are more about entertaining their owners and visitors, gardens that have hidden compartments, that have interesting walks, that are leading towards the idea of the English landscape garden as touted by Capability Brown by the middle of the 18th century. So she's got some fairly high-profile people working on this. And we have a plan dated to about 1726, attributed to Pope, although we know that Pope and Bridgeman were collaborating quite heavily. And it's interesting. The house is here at the top. The first thing to note is it doesn't go all the way down to the river at the bottom, and it doesn't go all the way up to the road at the top, or to the east, it doesn't go as far as Cambridge House gardens, because initially she didn't actually get those pieces of land. They were acquired in the coming years. So the initial designs were actually focused on a much smaller, tighter parcel of land. Now, we have a lawn as a central feature, and the site, when you do see it, is actually a series of 3 terraces down from the house, the lawn being on the upper terrace. There's a mid-terrace across that has a few features on it that we'll talk about in a minute, and then a lower terrace, which effectively was a floodplain for the river, and would have been off the bottom of this plan. Now, Pope was quite insistent, and actually there is a preserved letter where he says that she must have a lawn for bowls placed in front of the house, so the house can then be effectively used as a viewing stand for the games that go on. Pope had some very strong ideas about garden design, and was quite influential on Lady Henrietta. In addition to that, we have either side of this, we have these 2 semicircular flower beds, and they're edged by a series of trees that seem to line a path and have little, well, you can't really see it in this slide, but there are little archways at either end of them, suggesting some sort of pergola or arbor sort of covered walkway. And interestingly, everything to the left of this central lawn in this is very rigidly geometric and wouldn't be out of place in the 17th century as garden design. Everything to the right, however, seems to get a bit more messy and a bit more interesting. We have this complicated patch of garden here, which has a number of twisty paths leading to small compartments where you might discover a bench or an ornament on a pedestal or something like that. And then a similar set of twisty paths down the bottom. What we don't have yet is the grotto. That will come. But this initial design at least is starting to show we're moving away from the formal, even close to the house, and moving towards the idea of a garden where you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction, and you can feel isolated. And the garden compartment, even though it's fairly small and close to the house, can still feel like you're taking a long walk through the woods. Something mystical and magical effectively being built into the landscape. Interestingly, we have a map dated anywhere between 1748 and 1752, depending on which expert you ask and what day of the week it happens to be. But it's about mid 18th century, and it's to do with land cases with the acquiring of those extra plots of land that make up the full size of the park. And the interesting bits about it is it shows us in graphic detail the formal gardens, the bit that we were looking at understanding and restoring. And it provides a key as to what all the features in those gardens are, which is a miracle. Saved us a huge amount of guesswork and research. It also conveniently has a cartouche for the surveyor to the Duke of Argyll. So we know who commissioned it, and we know what it was about. And it was found in the Norfolk Record Office. And it massively transformed the nature of the project that was put to the Heritage Lottery Fund. In terms of, it provided detail that we didn't have at the very start. Okay, so if we zoom in on the top end of the formal gardens, next to the house, we have this area here, which is essentially a service wing that was built within Henrietta's lifetime. It was demolished in 1905 when the council took over the ownership of the site. And unfortunately, because it basically had a basement, it was pushed into its own basement rather than being carted away. And that means the asbestos that was involved in the various pipe work and such for the service wing is still there, which we discovered in 2016 when we first started work there, unfortunately. There's some other interesting features to it. Up here, we have an orangery, which doesn't survive anymore, but it's interesting to know that there was one. We have an ice house over here, which has a seat in front of it that we'll talk about in a moment. We have a 9-pins alley, which you wouldn't normally associate with a property of this standing, but apparently it was a big thing. Then we have the 2 arbors, the 2 covered walkways, either side of the flower beds that never got laid out. Instead, the lawn simply was oval shaped instead. And then down here, we have a grotto. And we know that because the key tells us it's a grotto. And that was a particular feature that Alexander Pope was insistent that Lady Henrietta have, because of course, everyone in the 18th century was starting to build grottos. Pope had a magnificent one built into the basement of his house that effectively connected the riverside lawn of his house to the gardens that he'd bought the opposite side of the road. He wasn't successful in shifting the road that passed the north side of his house, but he was able to tunnel under it effectively to get to his gardens. And he was keen that people should have grottos. And we'll talk about that in depth a bit later. Now, this plan shows a map of the site complete with contour lines. So you can see we have a terrace here, there's a mid terrace here, and then running off the bottom of the map is the floodplain terrace. And the red bits are all the trenches that we dug. Some of them in 2017. We had 2 episodes in 2017, one in March and one in August. These were the 2 trenches in 2016 that found the asbestos, unfortunately, and put paid to the idea of developing anything next to the house. And then we came back in 2020 to dig some more on both the ice house and the 9-pin alley site. And then in 2021, we came back and we excavated the grotto itself, which doesn't appear on this because you just make it too complicated. And in the arbor, you can see we have a lightning bolt shaped trench on this side where we were looking for the arbor and thought we'd cut across it. and then a second stab at it on this side, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. Okay, so we peppered the site with a number of trenches trying to locate these features in order to justify the way in which they would be restored by English heritage. Right, so, hang on a minute, I seem to have jumped. Yeah, okay, so that's, as I say, that's the ruins of the service wing and those trenches that we couldn't go any further with. Ice House, 9-pin alley, the arbor trenches. These 3 trenches, by the way, we wanted to understand how the terraces work. Yeah, were they artificial? Were they a later intrusion? We know the house obviously has a longer history than just Lady Henrietta. So we caught sort of the break of slope as it goes down. Amongst other things, we also caught the brick drain that goes from the house down to the river, which leads to the accusation that there's a hidden tunnel for people to get to and from the river without being seen, which is true if you're under 3 foot high and willing to climb through all the effluent that goes out through that drain, which I don't think anyone is. And then, of course, these are the trenches around the grotto. We started with these 4 trenches around the bottom here in March, and effectively identified the edges of the grotto cut, and then did more trenches in the August in order to understand the feature some more before we came back in 2021. Right, so if we start with the ice house, hopefully you're all fairly familiar with the concept, but just in case, essentially, in order to preserve ice into the summer, you dig a big hole, preferably above the water table, because you need a drain at the bottom of it to get rid of any melt water that comes off the ice. You line it with bricks. They're often egg-shaped, sort of standing on the pointy end of the egg, for maximum efficiency of structure. You line it with brick, preferably a double skin brick wall, maybe even with an air cavity between them, so like modern brick housing. And then you pile in the ice that you collect over the winter, or that you purchase because ice was coming in from Scandinavia. When they got their first frosts, the ships would come in laden with ice to sell to people in Britain. And you would fill up your ice house and you'd pack it with straw around the edges. And hopefully it would remain right the way through the height of summer. At least some of it would. You'd have to have a door at the top in order to get in, obviously. So that's usually at ground floor level. And then you put a dome over the top to trap in the air in the most efficient way, and then bury it under a mound of soil in order to provide some thermal insulation. And we know where the ice house was at Marble Hill because it's still there. This is the door on the north side of it, facing away from the sun, the mound behind it. And you'll notice on the door that the brickwork changes partway up because there's been a lot of rebuilding around here. Right, so looking at the plan, we had this lovely facade labeled seat before the ice house, with the ice house being described as in the thicket behind it. And it has these pilasters or something on the front and this lovely sort of decorative cornice at the top. And it looks like it's some sort of either round or square room behind it. And I've seen similar. This is at Rest Park, where I was digging in 2019. And it's a brick structure with a nice facade to it. And it's semicircular at the back on this one with a lovely bench. And it provides shelter from the rain, or a place to have private discussions or do whatever else it is that people in the 18th century might want to do away from prying eyes in a garden. And hers may or may not have been of similar nature. It could have been brick. It could have been a timber structure, much cheaper, obviously, then covered in some sort of rendering and laid out to look like stonework. And it was set at the top of an avenue of trees that had a view down to the river. So you would have a view up from the river to see this thing standing like a temple up at the top of the garden. So we figured we would find something. And we dug 2 trenches. I mean, in 2017, we couldn't get permission to actually tackle the actual ice house mound. There are issues to do with tree protection and nesting birds and such. And we were struggling to line that up in time. So we dug 1 trench down here, this trench 7 from our trench numberings, just to give us a window through the stratigraphy at the bottom of the ice house. What should we be seeing? And not surprisingly, it's brick earth most of the way down. We went down about 1.5 meters, and we're still in brick earth there. When we finally got to come back to do this in 2020, we designed a rectangular trench, honest, that basically examines the entire south slope of the ice house. So we should cross the line of where that seat was. The idea being that we get a running section down the hill. We had to take big chunks out of it for trees that were still there and needed root protection, hence the tortured shape of this particular trench, but it still gives us a running section down. So we thought we were in with a chance, and we should either find some sort of footings for a brick structure, or maybe some footings in a post hole, or cut some post holes for a timber structure, or some demolition debris or something. What we found instead was a number of fairly thick layers of various brick earths with slightly different contaminants in them, and sand going right the way down, well below ground surface for the surrounding landscape, and no sign of anything to do with the construction or demolition of any form of structure right the way down that slope. There were things in it. We had bits of bottle glass. We had fragments of pottery of the right date for the house, clay pipes. This one actually has a maker's stamp on it. All of this, however, looks like it's secondary, as if it's sort of midden deposit. Something's been moved from somewhere else and dumped here. So we wonder what was going on, and it wasn't in a good distributed pattern. It wasn't as if there was a midden dump here. It's just that the odd bucket load of material seems to have come in. And we finally got a chance to look inside the ice house, as my colleague Kevin, trying desperately to survey in a space that's not tall enough to stand in. And there's some lovely spiders in here, by the way. There's a rare species that apparently only exists in 2 places in Britain. One of them is this ice house. Giant white thing, because it lives in the dark perennially. You find out very quickly who's an arachnophobe. You do this sort of project. I thought they were lovely, personally. And we got a chance to look at the ceiling of it, and looking up the walls, there are oddities in the way in which the mortar works that suggests that at some point the ice house had a structural issue that had to be attended to. And if you build a brick structure and then bury it under a mound, how do you attend to a repair of the roof of it? You remove the mound. And in doing so, you remove any archaeological evidence it may once have contained. Because when you put the soil back, you know, your archaeology is gone. And I think had there been a seat, it will have been lost as part of that process. We can't prove that there was a seat, but we think there probably was. We think the map is as built rather than a proposal of any sort. But we just don't have the proof, I'm afraid. Right, now the next area we looked at was the 9-pin alley. And 9-pins has a long tradition, actually, as a game. We always think of it as pub skittles, a lowbrow kind of activity. But the great and the good were playing it quite a long way back. There's a 16th century engraving of 9-pins being played. And we can see, you know, you've got your pins in a square arrangement, and there's some sort of low fence to keep the ball from rolling on. These are features that we'll see again in a minute. And it's all wonderful. We know even in the 13th century, Edward was passing laws because his troops on campaign were far too busy playing bowls of various sorts rather than actually attending to their sort of weapons practice. And this is a perennial theme. Kings throughout the ages, Henry VIII had to at one point ban bowls of various sorts. It seems to come and go whenever there's an issue about people being too distracted. And the reason is, of course, it's not just the great and the good playing it. Here we have a pub garden with people playing 9-pins as we would recognize it. Proof in the background that you only rent the beer. And the problem is, of course, if you're here playing in the pub and gambling your money away and spending it on beer, you're not out at the butts practicing your archery. You're not in the workshop practicing your skills and earning money and saving that money to pay your taxes and your tithes. So the authorities weren't terribly keen on this idea. And And we know in the 1750s, the game of pub skittles was effectively banned in Britain. And here we see people breaking a skittles alley. And the important thing here is there's a square plate of some sort, whether it's stone or wood, we don't know, with markings for where you set up the pins. It seems to represent the alley. And of course, it's in a pub because you have the landlord standing here with his tankard. But the great and the good obviously must have continued playing. We also have images of this sort of thing happening during the various frost fairs on the Thames, which must have made it interesting to catch the ball if it missed, because I'm sure it would have skated away. Right, so in 1786, though, there's a pamphlet proposed by a society of gentlemen, as they call themselves, with proper rules for skittles aimed at the gentry and the middle classes and the great and the good. And it sets out all sorts of things, including a standardized format for the alley and an image of how the game is played. And we have these squares with the pins on them and boards that are involved. And if we zoom in on the picture, we have this raised sort of board to keep the ball in the court. And it's not actually standing proud of the ground, because you can see here there are people standing over the edge of it. So clearly the whole court must be recessed by the depth of the board, 5 or 6 inches or whatever. And we see servants bringing drink and food, etc., and some fairly posh people sitting around enjoying themselves while the games are being played out. Now, Lady Henrietta's court, unfortunately, I haven't been able to go to the Norfolk Record Office to zoom in and photograph this bit of the plan properly. So I've simply zoomed in on the scanned version that I was presented some time ago as part of the project. So it's a bit pixelated. I have to apologize for that. But we can see all the elements. We have our square in the middle with 9 dots on it, honest, if you squint really hard, where the pins would be set up. We have some benches either side of it for people to watch the action. We have, for some reason, 2 rows of trees in the middle of it. And there's a bone of contention between me and the people at English Heritage, because they have interpreted that as trees actually planted within the surface of the pitch. I rather think they would have been fruit trees in large tubs that would have spent the winters in the orangery and been wheeled out for the summer and placed here. But yeah, is what it is. And then, of course, there's an entrance through the boundary to the court, which seems to be some sort of hedge, some sort of overgrowth allowed to happen around the edges of it. And we have images, again, from the continent. There's a German one. We have our square with our pins on it. We have people sitting around either side. And it seems it's in an area that has a large approach to it. So not unlike the idea of those trees and the the trees here bounding some sort of walkway in. So we did, when we excavated there in 2017, we discovered fairly quickly that there's a thin depression filled with clay, about 6 inches high, just below the turf. The clay is lumps of effectively London clay, which doesn't happen out at Twickenham. You have to go further in toward the city to get deposits of London clay. Out here, it's all brick earth, which is this orange stuff, a fine silt that is still being deposited. For the past several thousand years, it's been blowing its way down the Thames Valley and settling on everything. And the brick earth itself has lots of patches of material and features in it as it's accumulated in what was effectively a water meadow for the past however many thousand years. We did have 16th and earlier century material coming out of it. But the interesting bit, this band of lumps of clay, it appears as if someone's brought in barrow loads or cart loads of lumps of London clay and then tramped them down to make some sort of surface. Unfortunately, the whole thing then goes out of favor in the 19th century, or sometime after Henrietta's plan is drawn, at least. And as part of improvements to it, it's completely grubbed up effectively and destroyed. And we only have the base of the clay left. But there are some patches of gravel as well. And what we think we have is a sequence where effectively there's a gravel area with the square plate for the pins, etc., and no significant below ground features, possibly replaced by an alley similar to the ones we've just seen, where it's in a depression with some sort of surface, presumably with a clay bed over which sand or whatever is placed. And then all traces of it are destroyed sometime by the end of the 19th century, such that basically no one knew it was there until we found the 1740s map. Okay, so they did restore it based on the 1740s plan. And my only, like I say, my only bone of contention is the planting of these trees actually through the playing surface rather than as ornamental trees in tubs. But it is quite nice. And I don't know how long it's going to last, but they have a cart that not only explains the rules and the history of 9 pins, but also has the pins and the balls so that you can actually play it. And they, for the opening of the gardens, they had a reenactor, basically showing people how to play the game. I hope it lasts, but it is quite a nice feature in the park. And I know the local bowls club are actually quite keen to start using it. Right, so the next thing we looked at is those curved arbors. Now this photo is just to show you the idea that we have trees lining, knitted together overhead, lining a path, in this case made of gravel. This happens to be at Colonial Williamsburg on the other side of the Atlantic. So clearly nothing to do with Marble Hill directly, but it's the sort of thing we're looking for. So you'd expect to find planting pits either side of a path as the archaeology that would be left behind. Now, by 1790, it didn't exist anymore. This is the plan for the auction of the estate. And you can see these are where the arbors should be. The trees follow the rough curve, but essentially it has all been left to go to seed. All those features are gone. We've lost by then the 9-pin alley down here. We've also lost the grotto, which we'll come back to in a minute, down here. And there was an Italianate garden installed on the middle terrace, this rectangle, which has come and gone by 1890 rather. And as part of that, I think that's when the 9-pin alley was demolished effectively and gotten rid of. So we know by 1890, most of those garden features seem to have disappeared. Interestingly enough, this map led to the sale in which the Cunard family of ocean liner fame purchased the site of Marble Hill Park with the intention of building a housing estate on it. And they did actually start work on the North Lawn, putting in foundations and services before there was a huge outcry. And the local authority stepped in and bought it from them, convincing them it would be a good thing for them to sell it to the local authority so that the public could use it as an ongoing amenity as a park, which is the only reason we have it today. And we have it in its full extent. Right, so as part of the various works that have gone on, the first edition OS, we didn't notice, there's a greenhouse, or the footings thereof, the fancy drain for the roof of the greenhouse, built sometime in the 19th century, mapped in the 1870s when the Ordnance Survey was in the area, and gone by the time anyone could notice it. Certainly was gone by the 1890 sale map. But this is in the trench where we're, the lightning bolt shaped trench where we're looking for one of the arbors. And you can see part of the problem. The topsoil certainly is heavily disturbed by a number of trees that have grown up since the end of the 19th century. The area basically turned into a self-seeded jungle. So they've churned up the top foot or so of soil, removing any hope of seeing planting pits for the trees that would have lined an arbor. But we're also not seeing any gravel in the section. There is gravel right at the bottom, but we'll come to that in a minute, because that's part of the gravel terraces that lie below the brick earth. But there's no gravel actually representing a path at about the height where it ought to be. And this trench should have crossed that line, but didn't. And we had the other trench on the other side. Similarly, there was a churned up level of where the modern trees and roots have removed any hope of seeing planting pits. And there was no gravel below that in the soil or in the brick earth below it. Now, we do know that the contract for the gardener for Henrietta, he had a salary, and out of that salary, he was to provide the gravel for all the paths. Now, if that's not an incentive to do the least that you could possibly do, I don't know what is. So it may well be that either he decided that these paths didn't need gravel, or that they had so little gravel that it doesn't even show in the soil anymore. But either way, we couldn't find them. However, English Heritage did restore what they saw in the plan, which is a gravel path with tree plantings either side of it in the right place. I did actually mark out where it should be based on the plan for them. So it is hopefully as faithful a reconstruction as we could hope to get with the evidence that we've got. Presumably, you can see the metal arches. Presumably, they will knit all this together over time. There's a small army of volunteer gardeners there. I'm amazed. In the time we've been involved, they've racked up something like 250 volunteers on site who come in and do all sorts of amazing work. It's well worth seeing. Anyway, so moving on from there, I mentioned that we dug trenches going down the terraces, which established that the terraces were part of the original design. So they hadn't been monkeyed around with much in the 19th and 20th centuries. Interestingly enough, though, and unrelated to everything else that we were doing, there were features about, well, we're talking half a meter down into the brick earth. And we've got various ditches and pits and stake holes and such mostly of indeterminate date. We're still working on the post-ex, so there wasn't a huge amount of artifacts found in it. But it means that pre-Marble Hill Park, this area did have human activity, and it probably covers underneath the entire lawn if we were to machine it off and look hard enough. So there's a lot of archaeology there, just not related to the garden that we see at the moment. Now, the grotto is an interesting case. This is a photograph I took looking east from the middle of the lawn, effectively, on the middle terrace at the grotto. And you can see it's surrounded by this wall of hedging and has these high bushes in it. And it's a sort of enclosed space. Off to the left here is the woodland that had that lightning bolt shaped trench cut through it to look for the arbor. So the main lawn is off to the left here. And if you go down to the right, you get to the floodplain and then to the river. And this is what it looked like up until December 2020 when they clear cut it for us to do some archaeology on it. And if we look from the other way, so this is looking west in through the entrance down into the grotto, there's a flight of gravel steps leading down to this lovely enclosed space. There's a brick frontage with an archway and the grotto chamber inside it, and then flanking walls either side. Unfortunately, while this all looks lovely and romantic, and unfortunately also was the kind of place that the youth of Twickenham would use for the sorts of things that youths of Twickenham do in a park where they don't want adults to be watching them. It's all a pastiche, because we have the drawings that show us what was built in the 1980s. Now, the story behind this is interesting, because the 1890 plan, as I said, didn't have a grotto on it, although we knew that one was built. And we have photographs in the archives, as eventually discovered, from the 1980s of GLC workers building the grotto that we now see, putting up all that lovely new stonework. It's something called Westmoreland stone, so it's been brought in from a long way away, onto the front of engineering brick supports at the back. There's an archway through there, but we'll come to that in a minute. And then a large crater where they've had to make some sort of access way down into this, because the whole thing is meant to be subterranean. And grottos were meant to be a mystical space where you almost touched on the magical, the fantastical. So why was that built the way it was in the 1980s? Because it was rediscovered in 1941 when a tree fell on it. The whole thing had been backfilled and removed from the scenery so thoroughly that nobody knew it was there. Then this tree fell down, and after cleaning up and sharpening some nice edges, absolutely wonderful right-angled corners, a man from the ministry, complete with armband, this was wartime after all, comes to look down the hole, and then they filled it back in again and put grass over the top of it, and everyone forgot it for another 40 years. And then in the 1980s, it was starting to sag into this brick chamber, which is actually part of the original 18th century build. This is what's behind that archway that we saw in the last image. And they decided they had to investigate it. And when they did, they discovered the top of this vault, and then they excavated it. So this is the original 18th century chamber for the grotto. So the grotto consists of, in my mind, a chamber, which is a subterranean cave, and then out in front of it is a depression, which is the bowl in which the grotto sits. So the grotto bowl, in my terminology. And here we have Jill Chitty, who at the time was a young archaeologist with the Greater London Council. And she, in association with volunteers from the Richmond Archaeological Society, excavated out the contents of the chamber itself down to the original pebble floor and some later features. And then the council came afterwards and they excavated an approach ramp to the front of it, which fortunately for us didn't actually touch the sides in terms of any of the archaeology out in front of this chamber. And they then restored it complete with a lovely concrete lid over the top of the chamber, which then was buried under all those hedges that we saw early on. But now that we've stripped that back, looks rather like a nuclear bunker. So here we have the 1740s map. We have the blue outline is the original extent of the grotto bowl, complete with paths around it and paths leading down into it and walkways at lower level, because the whole idea was to get this chamber below ground level. So it didn't stick out effectively. And the idea is, meant to be, like I say, a hidden cave. Again, it's one of these things about expanding your garden to be more than just the geometric sum of its parts. So fortunately, the GLC didn't touch most of this, and we were able to explore it a bit. Now, when we had trenched, the green trenches are our 2017 one. And you can see this one, we only excavated a narrow strip after opening the initial sort of footprint of the trench. But you can see in each one of these, we've clipped the edge of a hole. So we knew exactly where the extents of the grotto bowl were. And interestingly, we also knew that at this end, something different was going on. And the reason for that is the grotto itself effectively, oh yeah, this is the right slide, sits at the end of a tongue of sort of Thames gravel deposits. Now, most of the site, you have to go down at least a meter, meter and a half before you get down to any form of gravels. And it's all brick earth on top. Here, for some reason, this side of things, and it's at the same height going across. I mean, it's not like, this is in a depression. At the same height, the brick earth is only maybe, at least in this area, about 15 to 20 centimeters thick. And you come straight down onto a layer cake of gravels and sands, which is the sort of, what the glaciers gave us for the Thames. So what we think happened was, as they were building the house, they excavated a gravel pit because they needed aggregates, and aggregates are big and heavy and expensive to move and fairly low value in their own right. But you need aggregates to make your mortars and your cements and so on. So we reckon they dug a gravel pit on this little spur of gravel. And then once the house was built, of course, you had a large hole that needed filling in, and you either bring in expensive material from somewhere else to fill the hole, or you listen to your friend Alexander Pope, who's been whispering in your ear, you must have a grotto, and you build a grotto in that hole. So you use that depression to make a feature rather than a hindrance, which is why the grotto is where it is, as far as I'm concerned. Now, as I say, we clipped the edges of it. This is out beyond the eastern end of where the flight of steps were. And you can see we have these sloping layers coming down. We have lots of later infill when they got rid of the grotto. And some of that infill, I think some of the depression for the grotto bowl was left open at least up until after World War I. And some of that material actually is trucked in. It's building demolition material of all sorts, including the kind of salt glazed brick that you normally associate with things like public conveniences, those lovely glazed walls. So there's a lot of material being imported to the site. And then down at the bottom where we have the gravels, we have some curious features in the bottom of it. And if we look in from the top, these two circular things look suspiciously like planting pits along the line of a sort of a terrace level going down into the grotto. And indeed, when we dug inside the grotto in 2021, we discovered a planting pit here. There's another one just below the lip of this slot, so you can't actually see it in the photograph, unfortunately. On a lower level, this is the sort of, that lower level is much the bottom of the actual original grotto sort of landscaping. So fortunately, we have nearly half a meter of overburden that the council didn't remove on us. And then we have this row of cobbles that comes right the way across. There's a cobbled surface of some sorts preserved in there. So we've got original features, and we could tie them directly to the 1749 map, and using the various planting pits for alignment, we can actually drop that map exactly on the modern site, and they use that then to restore features within it. In the back here, we have these lovely 1980s stone walls, and then the archway behind. We were hoping somewhere in the material behind the stone walls might be some original sort of wing walls leading to the entrance, maybe an outer chamber. Yeah, so if we come in here, this is the looking down into that same where we were the last photograph. There's the planting pit up here. There's another one down here that's now been backfilled with sand. And then we have this cobbled surface that goes around. You remember there was a circular path in the bottom of the grotto in the 1740s plan, and a big chunk of vault here from the ceiling of the grotto chamber. As part of its, I think it was probably partly demolished in the 19th century, which is why we get bits of the vault out here below all the material that then gets put in the early 20th. But going into the chamber itself, this is the bit where we're in the 18th century, sort of in terms of brickwork. So this was actually built for Lady Henrietta, and it effectively stops up one end of her gravel quarry. We think beyond this was the ramp leading up, so that your horse and cart could pull the gravel up onto the main lawn and up to the house construction site. So this acted as a stopper for the quarry itself, and then the rest of the quarry was the grotto frontage. And you can see in here we've got all sorts of circular depressions, imprints rather, on the wall where shells have been mortared onto it. We've got material built up into the corners. You can see the tops of the archways where the vaulting has broken through, and then the lovely yellow bonded 1980s council work and the concrete lid at top just peeking out the top edge. And then down at the bottom, we have fragments surviving of a lovely pebble floor. And we'll look at that again in a minute. So yeah, in fact, we'll look at it now. But I hadn't realized the order of these slides. I don't have, by the way, I haven't figured out yet how in Zoom you can set up presenter view so you can see the slides before everyone else does. So having put this together some time ago, I'm seeing them at the same time you are. So I'm as surprised at the running order as anyone else. Anyway, so what we see here is a lovely set of patterns. We have these dark blue flint nodules where they're basically broken and then stuck broken side up. We have pebbles, and then there's a removed something through here. There's a band, a circular band that ran right the way around the room. Unfortunately, we have a big hole in, sometime later in the grotto's history, probably in the 19th century, judging by the ceramic pipe. They punch holes through both inside and outside the grotto to form these sort of sumps. That's the water table, about 1.5 meters below the floor in the summer. It comes up closer to the floor in winter, obviously. So they're worried about drainage at some point. Obviously, the grotto has ceased to be the grotto. It has ceased to have its decorative floor, which must have had some sort of image set as a sort of mosaic in it. But we've lost that. But we do have around the edges this lovely knuckle bone edging where essentially you take the leg bones of a sheep, and these are the knee joints, and you put them that end up on the floor as a decorative pattern. And it just acts as a separator between the different panels. All right, so looking in the corner, this is just inside the archway on the left as you go in. We can see some material down here, brick and lots of mortar effectively, this is the core of what's known as rustication, where you build up material against a hard geometric surface that you don't want to look like a hard geometric surface, because you want this to look like a cave, and caves are organic. So you build up material, and then you front it with a layer of stones and flints and shells and bits of glass, furnace waste from a glass works, where they take out the crucibles at the end of their service life, because crucibles only last about 3 weeks, maybe, at a go before the heat and the nasty corrosive chemicals kill them. So the trick is to get the crucible out of the furnace before it breaks, rather than letting it break and ruin your furnace. And then as soon as you take it out, the cold air makes it shatter, and you get these fist-sized lumps of interesting vitrified glass that you can polish up. And if you then decorate your walls with them, and you walk in with a candle or a torch or whatever, it all sparkles off and it looks lovely. And we know they were using these sorts of things for grottos. So we have our rustication down here, but interestingly, you can see it gets interrupted here. And we have these shell impressions. And the rustication would have continued up, but apparently was coming off for some reason. We know there's rustication to a much higher extent in some of the other corners. So clearly this was more a case of failure rather than a change of design idea. And we know from Italy, other sort of grotto type features, this stuff, once you put it on, it's a ticking bomb. You've got decades maybe before bits of it start coming off, because the walls are damp, the mortar gives up, things expand and contract as they get hot and cold. So you will have to put maintenance in. And at some point, someone has decided, since that's come down, we're going with a new decorative scheme. And instead of building up the rustication, we're going to embrace the square brick walls, and we're going to cover them in interesting shells. And these are the imprints of the shells. Basically, you put a blob of mortar as cement on the back of them, stick them onto the wall, and then eventually the shell pops off, because nothing stays there forever. And you're left with these wonderful imprints. You can actually identify species from them. We have a shell expert who is doing so as we speak. And here's a sort of grotto kit on a table. We have conch shells and brain corals. Again, unfortunately, products of the triangle trade. The ships coming back from the Caribbean have to bring something, and they know that the great and the good of Britain will pay good money for this stuff. So it comes back as ballast, effectively. And, which is good for the ships because they need some sort of ballast. And then when it gets here, it gets sold for cash money, or dumped on the Thames foreshore, depending on how the crew feels. And we know that there was a ready market for this material. There were auctions and such, and people explaining how to build your own grotto for the great and the good. And it was very much a woman's craft, in as much as it was the sort of thing that the lady of the house could do as a hands-on bit of garden work, in addition to just hiring in the workmen to come and build the basic structure. And there were people who gave courses on how to do so. There was a woman who advertised courses that taught you how to not only choose your materials, but also where to buy your tools, your chisels, your hammers, etc. How to mix the various types of mortars and cements for different materials. It was a booming business. And Lady Henrietta writes herself that she's over head and ears in shells. And later on, her niece complains that she's damaging her fingers doing this sort of work. But it was quite a popular thing in the early to mid 18th century. Now, one of the more curious things we found in the grotto, as we went around the back of it, this is the concrete lid at the top, built by the council in order to cover over the hole where the vault used to be. And we found this brick chamber, and it's odd. It's not huge. It's just over a meter square, and it's less than, well, it's about a meter deep, a bit less maybe. So it's maybe just over a third of the way down to where the grotto floor is on the inside, and it's got this tile paving to the base of it. And more importantly, it has 3 holes through it that have been plugged up. They're each half a brick wide by 2 bricks tall. And we thought that's a bit curious, because that looks like it's meant to have drained to somewhere. And we racked our brains as to what this could be. Is it a latrine. Seems a bit odd, given that it would then invariably leach into the grotto on the other side. And we looked inside, and sure enough, on this is the back wall of the grotto, so we're, our back is to the entrance. We have these 3 rows of half bricks, doubled up. And when we pushed a metal survey arrow through, of course, it comes right the way through, so they do line up. And further down the wall, we have another 3 that go to we don't know where. And the only thing I could think of was, although the water table does come dangerously close to the floor of the grotto in winter, there is no source of running water coming in at the top of the grotto to allow you to have any sort of water feature, which is another thing that we know Alexander Pope was quite keen on, because you needed that sound of trickling water in the background to add to the illusion. So I was wondering whether that space held some sort of lead tank, obviously not as ornate as this one, but it was the only one I could find a picture of in my collection. And that tank then would be filled up with servants when Lady Henrietta was in town, and it had a series of taps at the bottom with pipes coming out into the grotto, into the back of some sort of water features on that back wall, back when it was still rusticated and made to look more like a cave. And the water would trickle into that, making a nice burbling sound before disappearing through drains in the bottom holes, so as not to wind up on the floor and be a problem for the ladies' footwear. So it's all I can think of for that particular chamber. Now, outside the grotto, this is interesting. So we have the ornate pebble floor on the inside, and this is where the gate is. The actual gate panels were installed by the council as well, obviously. So originally it wouldn't have had that kind of fencing off. And we have a continuation of patterning here. So we have flints, and then there's pebbles in between. Unfortunately, we have the council walls, whose foundations, the orange mortar bed that they're in, cuts right the way through the edges of this floor on both sides, so it's neatly truncating it. And it has a large trench through where the pipe connecting this particular sump and the one on the inside that we saw earlier happened to be. There's a curious drain on this corner. Spoiler alert, there's going to be another sump under this wall. So, and if we look, there's a square, which is essentially the base of a brick pillar. And we found a fragment of that pillar further outside in the base of the grotto bowl. And effectively, it was coated in cement mortar and fragments of flints and such. So it was part of the ornate decoration. Why, we don't know, and why only one, why off center? There are questions that we don't understand. Whether it had anything to do with anything funny like masonry or something, we don't know. But this area clearly was ornately decorated. I originally wondered whether behind these walls there's the remnants of an earlier wall, and perhaps this was an outer chamber complete with a roof. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't seem to hold that up, because when we did remove those 1980s sort of stone and brick excrescences, and you can see the fragment left there, we did find a triangular stub of 19th century wall, which unfortunately has nothing to do with the grotto. It's not bonded in at all. It's got a nice vertical joint, and it sits on nothing. It just sits on the ground. There's no real footings to it. There's more footing to the 1980s work than there is to this, weirdly enough. And underneath here, this is our third sump. You can see the wall just skates across the top of it there. And when we remove the wall, which again, like I say, there's nothing below it, so it would have run across there. We have the sump, we have this pipe coming from that little rectangular drain cover that was just inside the foyer space. And we have a pipe that goes to we don't know where, that runs basically up the outside edge of the 18th century grotto chamber. Answers on a postcard. We don't have one under the other side. So clearly someone is trying to get rid of water in a big way around here, which suggests that the use of the grotto changed from being an ornamental space to being maybe some sort of storage. It had been called an ice house in the past. I'm wondering whether maybe acted as some sort of wine storage or beer storage or something like that in the grounds in the 19th century. Right, this is the grotto now. This is what English Heritage did in terms of restoration work, based roughly on the 1740s plan. So this is the original archway. They've had to rework a lot of the stonework around the edge because they took down the walls that scarred either side of it, and they reduced the height of it. So it no longer stands upright a meter above normal ground level, but instead is now flush more or less with the ground. I think since I took this photo, which was on the initial opening day in May, they've put some sort of fencing around the top, and they've removed all the Harris fencing that basically keeps people out. And there's a winding path that takes you down in, and this central path across. And then you can see inside the grotto, we had kind of thought that that's where the money was going to run out, that that's where English Heritage would stop, because the inside, the interior of the grotto is a tricky thing. How much do you restore? And if so, to what state do you restore it? Do you try to go back for an original look with rustication and lose all the shell impressions? Do you restore it as with the shells on it? Do you just cover the whole thing over? We weren't sure what was going to happen, but last week I was approached by English Heritage asking about getting some sort of survey work done on the inside, which suggests that maybe they are looking at doing something interesting inside there. So watch this space on that one. So we were able to inform these various features and the development thereof. Some of them have come out the way I thought they would, some of them perhaps not necessarily my vision, but it does make it more of an 18th century landscape, more in keeping with the house. And the house itself, now that it's been restored, is actually open and is free of charge pretty much all day throughout the week, which is a massive improvement on the situation at the start where you had to pay to go in and it wasn't open very often. So it's well worth the trip out if you get the chance. Right, so I'd just like to thank loads of people who were involved. Most of the historical research work was done by English Heritage researchers and by some of the other teams within Historic England, the landscapes team, etc. And our own geophysical team did a survey of the grounds, etc. And yeah, we're standing on the shoulders of giants with this talk. So I'd like to thank all of them, plus all of the staff on site at Marble Hill, including the army of volunteers who were very helpful. And the talks that I've given along the way over the last handful of years all seem to reside on YouTube. If you put into the search on YouTube Marble Hill, they should pop up, and if necessary, add grotto or nine pins or ice house or whatever, and they're bound to show up. Whether or not they represent the most current thinking, I wouldn't swear to, because obviously my thinking has been evolving over the project, and our research has sort of highlighted new ideas. But you know, it's all out there hopefully for people to understand, and we will be writing this up, and we